It's just a stupid childish game. That's what Jed Simmons thought to himself as he watched a gaggle of young girls hovering over 2 pencils and a piece of paper at the house of his best bud, Max. Jed and Max had been enjoying a night of gaming on the new 60-inch TV that had recently arrived, courtesy of Max's parents. But the girls, led by Anna, Max's little sister, had arrived and instantly dispelled this joy when they had started to play the Charlie game on the kitchen table. Loud chattering and occasional wailing sounds most effectively ending their fun, such that Jed and Max had no choice but to abandon what they were doing and go and attempt to drive the unwelcome arrivals away. They started by trying to join the proceedings. "Ask him if he'll get a freebie from a hooker," Max threw out. A comment that caused a little wave of laughter and some face-pulling from the girls. But they ignored him and asked another question instead. The pencil they were using had already moved once, for whatever reason, conjuring tumultuous screams from the witnesses. But despite 5 more questions having been asked, it hadn't moved since. "I need a new phone," Jed said, pointing to his eye. "I need one bad. Guess which one I want, Charlie. Please can I have it?" he blurted, as he pushed his face between the audience and right up to the pencils, jutting his chin out and pulling his face in an attempt to look as demonic as he could. The pencil moved straight to yes. The room exploded. The girls were screaming and running around. Max was shouting out, "Whoa!" repeatedly, while Jed put his hands up in a little victory salute. "Ask him if he's gay," Jed then shouted over the cacophony. Anna snapped a retort to Jed's fatuous question. "You shouldn't mock him, fool. And besides, if he's gay, he wouldn't date your ugly ass," she said, quickly melding the remaining screams of timorous fear into howls of mocking laughter. At 19, Jed wasn't about to be outdone by a 13-year-old girl, but for an instant he was stuck for a comeback. He was normally on it. He could have thrown down a cutting remark faster than spit, but his tongue froze in his mouth while his cheeks reddened for the first time in years, a fleeting state that only served to draw more derisive laughter. "Yeah, I'll tell that to your boyfriend," he eventually barked back. "Oh no, I can't. He doesn't exist," he said, as he walked around the table and went to put his arm round Anna's shoulders. "But don't worry, every dog has its day," he followed, a stabbing, worded weapon that elicited its desired response. Anna picked up a soda and threw it in Jed's face, while he alone laughed at his handiwork. The girls then threw out a torrent of comments in Anna's defense, but none had a fraction of the cut that Jed's had had. And Anna stormed off upstairs to her bedroom, taking the Charlie game and her friends with her. "She hates you, you know," Max said from the viewer's stand he had taken leaning against the cooker. "Yeah, I know," Jed replied, "but then she hates you, too." Max smiled. "Do you think there's anything to that crap?" Jed asked. "God, no," Max replied. "It's just idiots blowing on pencils or some breeze." And they both laughed at the thought of it as they went back to their amusements. A week passed. A week in which Jed had all but forgotten about the events over at Max's house, and his mind was taken up with the fact that he wouldn't be buying his latest version of his favorite phone, and it pained him. He'd always been there on the day of launch, ever since he was 12. Ever since the release of the first generation, he had been an addict to it. An addiction that had its roots in an episode which took place when he was 10. His parents were by no means wealthy, but back then their fortunes were considerably worse, and they had struggled just to pay the bills. Jed had to go without most of the trinkets everyone else took for granted, and it led to a period where he was bullied for the unbranded sneakers he had on his feet, and for the tatty little cell phone his father had passed on to him. Being kicked on the floor by a gang of would-be thugs forged two things in Jed's mind: that he would always do martial arts, and that no one would ever be able to look down on him for what he owned. So as the day of launch loomed, Jed became ever more neurotic, because he knew there was no way he could get the cash. Credit was out of the question. A bad episode with a credit card had blown that chance. He had actually had the money ready. He had made it working weekends at his dad's car wash business, an enterprise that had ever so slowly turned his parents' fortunes around. But the near $1,000 he had put aside evaporated when 2 weeks earlier he had held an impromptu party when his parents were away for the weekend. And what started out as a fairly tame idea was fueled by drink and other substances into a far wilder one, and the damage it caused saw Jed's dad take all his savings to pay for it, and he was going to have to work for at least 2 more weekends just to pay off what was left. So on the morning of Friday, the morning of release, Jed rose out of his bed like a tortured man. His day at community college would do little to lessen his misery, especially if he happened to see someone lucky enough to be walking round with that prized possession. He knew it would be months before he could buy the object he desired, weeks in which some disparaging glance at his now obsolete phone might be cast his way, a glance that would cut him. Not that he feared being bullied. 19-year-old Jed knew enough about how to fight that it would most likely be the bully on the floor being kicked. It was just that memory stuck in his head, that memory from being 10 years old. And he really didn't want to be reminded of it at all. He got up, showered, dressed, and went downstairs to find his mum and dad sitting at the usual places in the kitchen having breakfast. Jed never had breakfast. He never had the time. He steamed through and grabbed an apple as he made his way towards the front door. But just as he passed the threshold, his mom called him back. "There's a parcel here for you," she said. Jed was mystified. He hadn't ordered anything, and it wasn't his birthday or anywhere near. Maybe it's from Chloe, he thought to himself. Chloe being his girlfriend. And she had been away on holiday, but she was due back that very day. So why send a parcel when she could just give it to him? He mused. He reluctantly turned around to see his mom standing there with a small box held out to him in her right hand. Jed grabbed it and went over to the knife rack, splitting the lid open with a swift swipe of a blade. He pulled the cardboard halves away and drew back the packaging. "What is it?" his mom inquired. Jed stared at what was inside. a look of bewilderment on his face. "Some, pens," he replied. "They must have been sent by mistake. Some company has sent them to me. I'll sort it out while I'm on break." Jed's mom looked at him with a disbelieving look, but before she could ask to see for herself, Jed had turned and sped out of the door, the box clutched tightly in front of his chest. His mother watched him getting into his car, and stared as Jed gave her an uncharacteristic wave before he drove off down the street. What she failed to see was that Jed stopped some 100 yards from their house, and when he stopped he picked up that box once more, and with an almost religious reverence he carefully lifted it onto his lap and gingerly drew aside the packaging to again reveal its contents. There, sitting in that box, was a brand new, unopened phone, and not just any phone, but that $1,000 latest version that he burned to own. He punched the roof of the car in triumph before he jumped out and did a little dance in the street while cussing for joy to celebrate. It then suddenly occurred to him that it was just possible that his parents had bought the phone for him, even though they were acting like they were still angry at his wrecking ball party. Maybe, he thought, maybe they knew how much it meant to him, and had done the right thing. At least it was the right thing to Jed's way of thinking, and who else could it be? He knew Chloe was as broke as he was, and Max, great friend that he was, might have run to $50, but 1,000 was out of his league. Yes, it had to be his parents, he thought, and he dialed home. "Hey, thanks, Mom," he said, tentatively, as soon as she picked up. "What for?" she inquired, somewhat bemused. Jed's mind was on overdrive. From her response, obviously she hadn't bought it for him, and he knew his dad wouldn't do something like that without his mom's approval. "Oh, nothing," Jed muttered. "I mean, thanks for letting me know about the parcel." "But it's not for you, is it?" his mom asked. "Yeah, no, but at least I know now," Jed replied. He didn't want to say what was in that box. He wanted to be sure first where it had come from, before he risked parental intervention. He hung up and pulled the phone out. There underneath it was a bill, and it was made out to him, by name. But where the amount should have been, there were just zeros. Someone had sent it to him by mistake, a clerical error, the best clerical error he'd ever seen. He pulled back the tabs on the prize that by rights he now knew he should be able to keep. It was exquisite, beyond his wildest dreams, to be bathed in such disappointment, and then to be, as if by magic, delivered from that misery. And over the coming hours, and on his journey to college, and while in class, he had it unbuttoned and ready to roll. By the end of the day, he was already getting calls and messages from everyone who mattered to him, that is, to congratulate him on his latest acquisition. Everyone except his mom and dad. He didn't let all his friends in on the secret, though. The secret that his new phone was a freebie windfall. He preferred to make out that he had managed to get the cash. But one obstacle to him keeping it remained: his dad. He knew his mom would be on his side, eventually. but his dad might just insist he sent it back. He was a great stickler for honesty, and Jed knew it could go either way. As it turned out, his dad was not quite the roadblock he'd expected. At first he muttered on about doing the right thing, and what if you owned a business and you wouldn't want people to be untruthful with you, now would you? But in the end his mom came to his defense, with the mantra of it being unsolicited merchandise. And as Jed had a bill for $0 in his possession, it was legally his. And that was the end of the story, as far as she was concerned. So Jed's dad had no choice but to agree, which was fortunate to Jed's way of thinking, as he had no intention of returning it, no matter what his dad said. He would have rather thrown it under a bus. So that night he went out to meet up with his slightly jet-lagged girlfriend Chloe, his new phone in his pocket, and all the world was working out right for Jed. He got home a little past 11 that night, and feeling more tired than usual, he went almost immediately to bed, falling quickly into a deep sleep. But sometime just after 2 a.m. he awoke with a start. His phone was ringing, his new phone. He looked around for it, bleary-eyed, quickly remembering he had left it on his nightstand being recharged. He picked it up with the tender caution he only afforded to very new trinkets. And he was immediately shocked to see that there on the display was an eye, a human eye, not a small image, but full size, and above it just the letter C, which mystified him as he had no contact with a letter for ID on his phone. He swiped answer call, but when he did so, all he heard was a voice at the other end say his name, long and slow. Jed, it said. He instantly imagined it was some friend or classmate having a prank. Maybe when he was handing it round for people to look at, that someone had added this contact, he thought. Maybe someone jealous of him. And he cut the call, put his phone on silent, and went back to sleep. But not before he looked to see who this C was. But there was nothing there. No contact with that name, and no record of the call. 10 minutes later, he was awoken again by his new phone ringing despite having been set to silent. He reached over and picked it up, with less care than he did the last time. The eye was there again once more, with the letter C above it. He swiped answer call, and again a voice said, long and slow, Jed. Jed replied with the words, fuck you, and he cut the call. This time he switched his phone off altogether. His adrenaline was up, and it had angered him, that second call. 1 was possibly funny, but 2 far less so, he thought to himself, and it took him a good 15 minutes to get back to sleep. But 10 minutes after doing so, the phone woke him once more. Jed stared at it, trying to work how on earth it had turned itself back on. This was no toy, after all. It was a state-of-the-art piece of high engineering. A small flaw he could live with, but not this. The image of the eye was there, but this time it was looking to the left, as if it was looking in his direction. He snatched the phone up, but as he brought it in front of him, the eye appeared to follow him. Jed glared at it, trying to work out what freaky bug someone had put on his phone. He decided not to answer the call, choosing to turn the phone off again instead. But he couldn't, and the phone appeared to swipe itself, and that voice returned. "Jed! You owe me, Jed!" it said. Jed replied, with barely concealed rage. "Who are you?" he seethed. But before he could finish those words, the call cut itself off, and Jed was left sitting on the edge of his bed, his face twitching in a quizzical expression, and his head ached at the thought of just how clued up this phone pest must be. He left the phone switched on, and after 30 minutes of staring at it, waiting for another call, he eventually fell back to sleep, and the rest of the night passed without event. He woke sometime just after 7, and almost as a reflex checked his phone. A couple of messages had arrived, but they weren't what he was interested in. He scanned to see if there had been any more calls that hadn't woken him, and it was then that it occurred to him that he had a slight problem. This phone had come to him for nothing. How do you get that repaired under warranty, he thought, when it might throw up that he hadn't paid for it? And he thought he might well just be stuck with it. It was Saturday, a day for washing cars, but he was no good for work, and kept wandering off, making phone calls to everyone on his contacts list to try to see if they gave anything away that might say they were the culprit. But in the end he had nothing, and his final call was to Max. Max knew how he had come by the phone, but when he heard about the previous night's events, he went silent. Jed rambled on about finding out who it was, but eventually had to ask Max why he wasn't speaking. Max mumbled something about the Charlie game, and that it seemed strange a phone just arrived after he'd asked for one. Jed laughed. "Really?" he said. "You're telling me that my stalker is a demon?" He laughed again, harder this time. "Thanks for the help there, Max," he followed. "I'll be sure to ask you next time my car won't start. You'll be telling me it's gremlins and sprinkling some pixie dust on my engine. You've got to stop watching those Disney channels with your little sis. It's screwing with your head, bro," he said. Max laughed, and left some choice expletives to lift Jed's mood. And they did help. Jed was less worried, and for the rest of the day his phone acted perfectly normally, even while he was over at his girlfriend's house chilling later that night. So normal, in fact, that Jed had almost forgotten the previous problems. That was until he was back home, in his bathroom, squeezing the last drops of toothpaste from a tube he thought his mom should have replaced days ago. It was then he heard his phone ringing from his bedroom. He hurried as best he could to catch the call. But when he got there, his phone, lying on his bed, stopped ringing the instant he walked in the room. Yet there he could clearly see the eye that had taunted him previously. It had returned, and it was no longer a fixed image, but was moving, looking side to side as if searching for something frantically. Jed stood, motionless in the doorway. He didn't quite know what to do, whether to ignore it and hope that whoever it was, that they would go away, or to pick it up and shout obscenities at them. He began, against his rational conditioning, to fleetingly consider that Max might just be correct, that this might just have something to do with that stupid game and as superstition started to overtake him, so his anger returned. In the very unlikely event that these calls were paranormal in origin, he wasn't going to be afraid of some crappy demon, whose only claim to fame was to pull off parlour tricks. He walked slowly towards his phone, stopping only when the eye appeared to register him. It fixed on him with an iron-cold stare that momentarily rattled his resolve to approach. Jed glared back. Reaching down, he picked it up and looked straight into the eye that was now following his every move. "I'll find out who you are, and I'll fuck you up," Jed said. The eye looked back at him, merciless and hateful. "Jed, you owe me, Jed." "What do you mean?" Jed demanded, his voice brimming with suppressed violence. "You owe me, Jed. Pay me," it said. Jed replied, "You're one fucked up puppy. Call me again and I'll have you tracked. I have a friend who can do it and will come over and shut you up for good." "Pay me, Jed," was the only reply. Then the screen went blank. He threw the phone onto his bed. He wanted to throw it at the wall, but its value made him temper that urge. That night he resorted to wrapping his phone in clothes and putting it in a box. He didn't want to be woken up again by whatever stalking weirdo had managed to get hold of his number, and he wanted to be fresh for the next day, as he had every intention of following through on that threat, regardless of the consequences. Even so, at 2:22 and 3:33, he was woken by the muffled sound of his phone ringing, and it appeared once again to answer itself as stifled words came from the box. Fortunately, he could sleep in the next morning, as he only had a few hours of work that day. But even so, he set off for work in a daze. Although he'd slept, it had been a broken sleep, and it didn't seem to have refreshed him at all. His day passed in a mist. He didn't want to talk to anyone. When friends rang his phone, he didn't answer. He didn't even want to take it out of his pocket to see who was calling. He took his old phone with him that day as well, and started messaging people to tell them to call that instead. But even this task he couldn't grasp as he wanted to. His mind just seemed to be wandering. That voice saying his name kept coming into his mind, almost as if he could hear it, and every time he blinked, it seemed like that eye was reflecting on the back of his eyelids. He had fully intended to call his cousin that day, as he just happened to work for a telecom company, and he knew some tricks about how to trace callers. But the thought of it, and the intention to track down his abuser, just seemed to wander from his head, and in what seemed like the blink of an eye, the day evaporated, and it was 7:30 p.m., and he was back in his bedroom, his brain slowly coming back to its proper focus, as he tried to work out why his mind had been so fogged all day. He cancelled his intended trip to see Chloe that evening, as he knew he had to get to the bottom of what was going on, and to solve his problem. And one thought came into his mind, and there was something he had to rule out, something he had to know. And so he went online, and as best he could, he set up a Charlie game. And he called to Charlie. "Do you want me to pay you?" was his first question. The pencil quivered. Jed didn't want it to move. He wanted it to stay right where it was. But then it did. Clear and sharp, it sued to point to yes. Jed was having none of it. It must be a breeze, he thought to himself, as he jumped up and ran downstairs, returning with one of his mom's mixing bowls, with which he could eliminate any draughts or even his breath, as being the cause of any movements. "How do you want me to pay you? Do you want me to do something for you?" he quickly asked. Again, the pencil moved straight to yes. Jed went cold. He still didn't believe it, but at the same time he did, as he had no rational explanation as how that pencil could be moving. "Do you want me to hurt someone?" he asked. It oscillated, then moved towards no. Jed breathed an uncontrollable sigh of relief, but it evaporated when the point stopped in the middle, before returning aggressively to yes once more. Jed bit his lip, the only outer sign of the turmoil now gripping his mind. His next question, "Is it you calling me?" His phone rang the very next instant he finished speaking, and in tandem with the movement of the pencil point, a voice from the phone hissed, "Yes." That did it for Jed. He picked up the pencils, snapped them, and stomped them underfoot. He took hold of the phone. He didn't want any cursed phone. It occurred to him that it was 1,000,000 times better to have no phone than the piece of shit he now owned. He headed downstairs, went through the side door into the garage, where he found his dad's claw hammer. He put the phone on the workbench and proceeded to use all his strength to smash it to pieces. A week ago he could not have imagined doing what he was doing now, destroying his most cherished possession, but here he was, doing it. He battered the fragments to a crumpled mix of plastic shards and twisted metal, and then with a desolate heart at what he had been forced to do, he scooped up the pieces, put them in a bag, and threw the bag in the trash bin outside. He climbed the stairs back to his room, still buzzing and burning with rage, but satisfied that he had corrected what was now clearly a terrible mistake. He had a small laugh to himself at the top stair, about how it turned out that Max's little sister had been right after all. It really wasn't smart to mock. Not that he'd be telling her about it, or anyone else for that matter, aside from maybe Max and Chloe. But as he approached his bedroom, he heard a noise that filled him with dread. It was his phone, his new phone and his new ringtone, and it was coming from inside his room. He unwillingly opened his door, and there in the middle of the bed, as if the past 15 minutes had never happened, was that phone. It stopped ringing the moment he saw it. The eye was there on the screen, looking directly at him again. "Pay me, Jed," the voice rasped at him. Jed's mind felt like it was in a blender. It felt like everything he knew, everything he understood was lies, and here was reality lying on that bed in front of him, inexplicable, unimaginably powerful in ways he could never understand. He ran over to the phone, grabbed it again, twisted it in his hands in an attempt to break it into two. It flexed, and the screen flickered on and off, the eye buzzing with interference. Then he ripped open the back and tore out the battery. He turned and ran downstairs once more, almost tripping as he went, as a mix of fear and uncontrollable anger drove him on. He had one intent: to destroy it, even though his last attempt had achieved nothing. But this time he would be more thorough. He thought to burn it. It's evil. Burn it. And he got his dad's blowtorch and set about it, even though the battery were laid next to it. The eye reappeared when the flame touched the phone, and the voice returned with it. "Pay me!" it rattled. "Pay me, Jed! Pay me!" But it weakened as the plastic and acrylic melted, and the phone's little circuit board fused. Its microprocessor boiled and burned, and the voice juddered, and then died away to nothing. Jed was hopeful that this time he had truly solved the problem, that he had done it the right way. He gathered the pieces, the charred shards, and took them down the street and threw them into a storm drain. It wasn't exactly what he wanted to do with them, but it was the best thing he could think of at short notice. He returned to his house and once more climbed the stairs to his bedroom. But this time silence. No phone awaited him except his old one. He breathed a sigh of relief. This episode, this horrific learning curve, was over, he thought. He climbed into bed and was just about to get to sleep when he was jolted with the sound of a phone ringing. He panicked, looked around himself, half conscious before realizing it was indeed his old phone. And when he looked at it, it was Chloe calling. He answered, barely able to conceal his relief at hearing her voice. And it led Chloe to ask if he was okay. But he hid his little night of horrors, and Chloe went on to tell him that she had just had a dream, a nightmare, and she had to call to be sure he was safe. In that nightmare, Jed was a monster, and he was going around killing people, she said. But it wasn't really him. It was something else, something pretending to be him. Jed was freaked out at hearing this. He wanted so much to tell her what he'd done and what had happened. But when he opened his mouth to speak, not only did he feel foolish, he also felt that she'd think him crazy, and maybe even ditch him if he relayed such a tale. So he told her not to worry and that it was just a dream, even though he himself was worried. And she went with the words, "Yeah, it's just a silly dream. Love you." And he in turn told her he loved her too. He lay there afterwards, trying to make some kind of sense of what he'd experienced, but he couldn't. All he knew for certain was that he never wanted to see that phone ever again. In fact, it was the last phone he was ever going to buy. He was going to stick with his old phone until it was some creaking antique, and that was the very thought that went through his mind just before sleep came. His dreams that night were confused, images horrifying, monstrous, people screaming, blood. He awoke earlier than normal the next morning, just after 6. Dawn's light making him squint more than it should have done, as his eyes felt heavy and congested. Maybe it was the burning plastic from the night before, he pondered as he struggled out of bed, but he felt dirty and desperately needed a wash. So he shuffled out and off towards the bathroom, where he stood for a moment, blinking in front of the mirror, trying to get his clouded eyes to focus on his reflection, but they only cleared when he splashed some cold water onto his face, and as they did so he could see that he seemed filthy, as if some browny reddish hue were all over him, in his hair, all over his skin, even on the boxer shorts he had slept in. "What the hell is that?" he thought to himself as he splashed more water over his bleary eyes. His hair seemed matted with it, and as he looked at the coating on his hands, and the substance now washing down the sink, it dawned on him what it looked like. It couldn't be, he thought. It can't be blood. It must be smoke staining. And then he heard a sound he now dreaded. His new phone, that possessed monstrosity, was ringing, or at least it sounded like it was, ringing in his bedroom. Jed's mind instantly clouded at hearing the sound. He so didn't want to be hearing it. He couldn't tell in his half-conscious state if the previous night's events were real or dreamt. He didn't want to go out and find out. He wanted to stay here where he was and ignore the sound until it went away. But he knew he had to go, to know. For if that phone was back in the cold light of day, he was going to lay it to waste. And not alone this time. So he turned to leave the bathroom, but as he did he was frantically mumbling to himself that it was just a dream, just a crazy dream. As he approached his room his mantra faded from his lips. His door was ajar, and the noise of that phone was deafening, so much that it was hurting his ears as he pushed that wooden rectangle away. Then suddenly a memory flashed into his head, like a blinding light that drowned out his vision and replaced it with something he had somehow forgotten. In it he had a knife in his hand. He was stood outside his girlfriend's house, outside Chloe's house, and he had a knife in his hand. He knew it had happened, and it had happened last night. He knew that, but he didn't know how or why, or what happened next. His stomach felt like it was filled with ice as he peered into his room towards the source of that ringing. He knew he had to look in, knew that if it had returned he would have to destroy it again, somehow. But could he? His eyes fell on it, its black screen and little white case. So small and innocuous, yet it seemed to fill the bed, fill the very room. He gazed at it, transfixed. Then another flash of memory. His hands, blood on his hands, and that knife, covered in blood. He could see the bedclothes on his bed were pushed back, and his sheets were covered in bloodstains. And he knew then that his memories must be real, for he had no injuries or wounds from which any blood could have come. Then the eye flickered to life on the screen of that phone, flickered and then fixed itself on him. "Jed!" The voice rippled through the air, the very sound of it seeming to pull at the fabric of Jed's mind. And with that sound the cloud which had concealed the night's events was seemingly finally lifted, and the previous night's events flashed into his mind. He was inside his girlfriend's house, then he was upstairs, an arm stabbing and slashing. Then he was at Max's house, in Max's room. Scenes of unspeakable brutality appearing before him. Jed covered his face with his hands, scraping his fingers across his skin in a futile, symbolic attempt to pull those terrible images from his mind. But when he looked back to the bed, the phone was gone. His eyes searched the room frantically. He had to find it, to destroy it. Then he could hear it again, ringing, coming from the bathroom. Jed turned and ran towards the sound. Water was still splashing from the tap he'd left running, and there on the tiled top the phone awaited him, the eye seeking him as he entered the room. Jed rushed towards it and grabbed it. He had no clue what he should do next, but getting hold of it, to stop it escaping again, was all he could think to do. Then, as if in response to his touch, the eye disappeared and was replaced by a dark, hazy video playing on the screen. At first, Jed couldn't tell what it was. It was mostly of the floor, then a door. His girlfriend's door. Then up some stairs. Her stairs. Jed wanted to look away. He knew in his heart what was coming. He had to know what had happened. And then his darkest and most terrible fears came to life as a kitchen knife flashed onto the screen. A kitchen knife that was butchering the girl he loved. Jed couldn't help himself, vomiting uncontrollably at what he was witnessing. Yet even so, he seemed unable to stop himself looking back as the knife went before the screen, as it went to her parents' room, and meted out similar horrors as Chloe had received. Jed was falling apart. His life was over, he thought. If he had done those things, then he didn't want to live, didn't deserve to. He wanted to end it there and then. And thoughts of razor blades and high bridges crashed into his mind. The slaughter that phone was replaying then seemed to have ended, at least in that house. And Jed looked as the phone recorded the killer's movements down the stairs. His movements. Then the camera lifted such that Jed could see a mirror. It was dark, only partially lit from the light on the landing above, but he could see it was a large mirror that he was familiar with, one that Chloe had always checked herself in before going out, and as the camera tilted, Jed could see his reflection in that mirror. He was soaked in blood. It was running down his face, was spattered all over his clothes. But one thing stood out to Jed. It screamed to him. His eyes were closed. And with closed eyes, he walked forward out of shot, leaving the phone seemingly hanging in the air, and instantly Jed realized that he was not holding it, that he could see someone else. At first a haze, but instantly Jed realized that whoever, whatever this person was, it was they who were holding the phone, and whoever was holding that phone had done the killing. Then the haze moved forward and came closer to the mirror. At first Jed thought it was a man, then an adolescent boy. The screen flickered as it approached. It seemed to bring a darkness with it that obscured its image, but for a second he could see it, a monstrosity. He could see its sickening, mocking smile, and its eye, an eye he was all too familiar with, the vilest selfie he had ever seen or could imagine. Jed knew in that instant that he had been sleepwalking, and that he had only been there in a zombie-like state. But who would ever believe this? His only proof lay in his hand in that video, and his grip tightened vice-like on that phone. He knew he had to keep hold of it, no matter what. It was his alibi, his only chance of salvation. It couldn't bring Chloe back, but it could save him, he thought. Yet at the back of his mind, a great doubt was gnawing. Then a noise distracted him, screeching tires outside somewhere. He looked up and back into that bathroom mirror, a harrowing gaze of dread and utter bewilderment on his face as he struggled to control his crumbling mind. But his mind no longer felt like it was his own. It was a soup of confusion, almost as if it were on a roller coaster, and neither he nor anyone could stop its descent. And then something in his left eye caught his gaze. Something flickered there. He could see it, not a reflection on his pupil, but almost as if he could see through the orb of his own eye. That something lay beneath it. He looked back at the phone. It was relaying the events that had taken place at Max's house, a horror equal to that which he had just witnessed, as his bud, his best friend and greatest ally, was cut down, and Jed felt every slash of that blade. As he stared in numbed horror, Jed's only miserable respite being his recollection that Max's family were away, a dark and horrific blessing that Max had been alone. Another sound pierced his tortured mental carousel, a door banging. He looked back at his hand, looked back to the phone, but his hand was empty. The phone had vanished. His fingers were still clenched as if holding it, but there was nothing there. Yet he could hear it ringing again, loud and close by. He glanced around furiously, but nothing. A crashing sound downstairs. He looked back to the mirror, that light in his eye. Then fleetingly another eye. He could see it moving within the dark of his own pupil. And that phone, ringing and ringing. Footsteps thudding hard on the stairs, coming towards him, and he knew then where that sound was coming from, knew as the door flung open and a dark-suited figure smashed into his private space. A figure that said 3 violent words to him, as it pointed a gun at his head. Jed's hands flung instinctively into the air, as "Drop that weapon" reached his ears. I have no weapon, he thought in a fractured second. But as his eyes desperately glanced at his hands, to confirm this thought, there in his fingers, in his clutch, was a kitchen knife, clotted in blood. Jed looked back at his invasive assailant, a look of helpless questioning on his face that bemused the observer. And in that instant, Jed knew where that phone was. As the knife fell from his grip, he knew where that ringing emanated from. He could hear it, clicking inside his own head, as it swiped itself, as it answered its own call, a noise that he knew only he could hear, that only he would ever hear. Then a voice. "Charlie, Charlie, out to play!"